Episode 202. It's time to get things started. This is the World Organic News for the week ending 10th of February 2020. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Given our introductory tagline, decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil, this episode is going to be a bit of a rant around those ideas. Today I attended a Northwest Tasmania Wynyard District Permaculture Tasmania meeting, and everyone has enough knowledge there, and there must have been about 50 of us, I guess, that came for a set-up meeting and a bit of a chat and lunch. And everyone there has some skills that could get this process started, particularly the recarbonising the soil part of the tagline. It's getting to the point now where if we don't act, there's going to be trouble. There's already trouble. The summer of bushfires we've had has now been replaced with flash flooding, where my children live between two of the monster fires that are now out, and which caused me some 2 or 3 months of concern. They've now had 6 inches of rain in 24 hours, or 150 mils in the new money. They're at the top of the mountains, and there's flash flooding. The railway line has collapsed between two of the townships up there, and there's a monster cyclone that's hit off the northwest coast of WA. It's all happening as predicted, people. All this faffing around with carbon taxes and measuring carbon and this and that. It's perfectly clear who the major polluters are. There's probably about 11 companies in total that are producing 95% of the carbon. We just need to put them in their place. Now, clearly they're switched on enough to lobby governments and maintain control that way. Our 48,000 people in mining compared to several million in the tourist industry as a political force is just beyond me. Our two main political coalition groups here, the Liberal Nationals, or the current government, they're a coalition. And the main opposition party, the Labor Party, which comes from a union background, are both in favour of new coal mines and new coal-powered fire stations. It's fairly clear now from the price signalling and the prices that wind, solar and heat storage is cheaper than building coal-fired power stations. And yet our federal government is trying to push one through and is getting the support of the opposition. This is in the summer where millions of acres have been burnt to a crisp. Yeah, some of them are coming back because that's what the Australian bush does. It regenerates. But the intensities of these fires are such that it's going to take much longer to recover. And then the intensity of the downpours is removing what little topsoil there may have been. Towns are flooded. People that thought they were safe from the fires are now underwater. And this is just the beginning. The patterns of a big sort of inverted horseshoe across Australia of low pressure systems feeding hot air across the deserts and down into the southeast has now been replaced with an inverted horseshoe of low pressure systems pumping water down into the southeast. That and an east coast low, which is throwing loads of water onto the fire affected areas. And while it's good to see the fires being put out, the pendulum swing has been quite extraordinary. Australia is known as a land of droughts and flooding rains, but the extent of the extremities is just mind-boggling. Here in Tassie, we've been okay. There's been some fires, and the east coast of Tasmania is relatively dry compared to where we are. But even in the roaring 40s down here in Tassie, where rain is normally complained about, most of the state is being put under water restrictions, level 1 and 2 to be fair, not the level 5s of Bathurst and Orange up in New South Wales, but still water restrictions in Tassie. It's just the locals are gobsmacked, and I am too for that matter. It's past the time we did stuff. We can no longer rely on governments to do the right thing, in inverted commas, to lead and show some responsibility for what's going on. And it has to be a whole of world thing. The excuse our federal government uses is that we're only 1.38% of the emissions in the world. Because conveniently, the coal we export and is burned elsewhere, they don't count among the emissions from Australia. But even if it were only 1.38%, we can still show some leadership. If we introduce the right measures, decarbonise the air, decarbonise the roadways, decarbonise industry, and we end up with clean air, clean water, clean soil that we can then recarbonise, we end up with healthier people, with lower costs in health, even though our healthcare is covered here. And I understand it's painful for people where they don't have a decent health system. But even then, we could take the pressure off the health system by producing healthy food for people to eat while they breathe healthy air, walking on healthy soil, and drinking healthy water. How is this such a bad thing? It is beyond me. Clearly, the clean air mob, of which I would include myself, don't involve ourselves in lobbying politicians and schmoozing and teeing up prime jobs once they leave Parliament. The way to get at these people, I'm sure, is through the banks. If we stop the financing of these new coal-fired power stations and the monstrosity that is the Adani coal mine in the Galilee Basin in Queensland, if we cut them off where the only thing that matters to them is their cash, then there is some hope that we can get them to redirect their efforts. The amount of time and energy that's been put into maintaining the coal-fired systems in this country alone, if it had been put towards renewables, the whole world would have a shining example. But we haven't. Apparently back in the 60s, the then Conservative government was offered the opportunity to set up a transistor factory facility, a manufacturing facility. And the response from the government at the time was that would destroy our valve industry. Now, for the young at heart out there, and those that don't remember, a valve was a glass vacuum tube that did the job of a transistor, that is, it's a switch. But they were much bigger, much heavier, much bulkier, and sort of antiquated stuff, the sort of things that we used by Turing and whatnot to build difference machines. And the transistor was a huge step forward. But of course, that would have destroyed the valve industry. Now, as it turns out, the transistor did destroy the valve industry. But we were left without a transistor industry to fall back on. So you can see there's a certain pattern going on here. The fact that most Australians now have got no problem at all with putting solar panels on their roofs, even as the feed-in tariffs drop down to commercial levels rather than, nudge values, where people are given more than they probably the electricity is worth in order to get round to doing it, means that the individuals can see the benefit, and yet the federal government, and to a large extent most of the state governments, haven't been much use either. We need to kick up a stink, people. We need to get things moving. I get quite disappointed when I watch the news or read the websites, the same political dilly-dally. It's like it's time for a whole new system. But to do that, you normally have to wreck the old one. I'm hoping for evolution rather than revolution. If we use the structures of government we have but replace the people in them, then there's some hope. It is disappointing to have lived through this time knowing that everyone has known since the 70s. The oil companies have internal documents from the 50s discussing the fact that climate change was coming and how they could make as much money as possible before it became politically untenable. Now, if you imagine if those same oil companies had put their money into a solar and wind and whatnot, alternative energy sources, and electric vehicles, how the world would be different. There'd have been no war in Iran or Iraq. There'd have been no 9/11. There'd have been no overthrow of the democratically elected but leftist government in Iran in the 50s. Yeah, that might still have happened, but there wouldn't have been the need for the Straits of Hormuz to be kept open for oil. The whole world would have a different flavour to it. And the amount of suffering that's been caused by this commodity is beyond belief. We need to make electricity a commodity, renewable electricity. We need to do it yesterday. Now, I know each one of my thoughtful and intelligent listeners is fully aware of all this and are doing what they can. I know we all are. But if you haven't started gardening yet, or you think it's something you'd like to try on an easier way, go over to worldorganicnews.com and grab yourself a free copy of the World Organic News No Dig Gardening book in PDF form, and you can make a start. Bill Mollison summed it up when he said we need to move from consumption to production, and he reckoned back in the olden days of the 80s and 90s that only 10% of us needed to start growing enough food for those around us to save the world. It may need to be more than that now. It may need to be about that. But until we hit that threshold, we're never going to know in the West, in the industrialised countries. I understand in great swathes of the world, South America, all through Asia and Africa, and probably large parts of the Middle East, people do grow their own food, but they too have been got at and been forced to grow cash crops to buy food that's imported so that they can export the one cash crop for the country. But I'm sure there's still a lot of people across this planet of ours that are growing their own food. But they're not the ones putting the pollution into the air. It's up to us in the industrialised West to take responsibility for our actions, decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. It's doable. So let's do it, people. And on that somewhat hopeful note, even though I might not sound it, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week.